Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Good morning. It's so good to see you all. Just a quick kind of little family note here before we dive into the message this morning. Spent the last couple of days off-site meeting with our elder board. Friday all day, part of the day yesterday, just getting together is an incredibly, just an awesome time that we got to spend together in a couple of different ways. I mean, just investing in those relationships, and that was so powerful and just really good. I want you to hear just from my heart just how good it was to be with our elder board these past couple of days, because so much of it was just relational, and we got to invest in each other in some really important ways, and that was awesome. But it was also just a really important time for us as an elder board to get away and dream and pray and reflect on where God is leading us into this year and really into the new season. And man, I got to tell you, you are loved and you are cared well and you are led well by this team of people who have an incredible heart for God, have an incredible heart for you all, for Cypress, and are just really passionate about where God is leading us. And so I wanted to share that with you. I'm super excited about some things that are coming out of those conversations, things that you're going to be hearing about here very soon. And let me tell you, as often as we talk and as we've been dreaming and praying together, our heart, our dream, our vision for Cypress has just been getting clearer and clearer as we're really setting out to build this growing and diverse community where every member of your family can be deeply connected and firmly grounded in their faith and actively invested here and far. And that's where we believe God is taking us. And I'm so excited about that. Of course, that all we need, funding for this vision to take shape, as you all know. And so I just want to piggyback on what Michelle said earlier, that it is so important that we take a moment just to hear where God how we've taken shape with our 26 budget and what that looks like. And if you have any questions, would encourage you to stick around after the service. So just a little bit of an announcement for you from my heart and before we dive into the teaching today. But as we enter into this next part of the series that we're in, I was thinking about this, and I'm curious what you think of when you hear the phrase work in progress. Work in progress. A lot of times I think we hear this, and it's like, this almost sounds like a warning. Like keep in mind, this is a work in progress, which is kind of like, hey, manage your expectations. You're probably going to be disappointed. Right? I remember years ago, so when I used to be a graphic designer, this was like my first career, long time ago, but I got to a point where I didn't even want people to see my work when it was in various stages of progress, like when it was in process, because it's like it didn't matter how much I tried to explain to them, listen, this is a work in progress, and it didn't matter how much I tried to help them see, because I knew exactly where it was going. I could see the finished product. I knew the creative direction, but it didn't matter how much I tried to explain that. They just couldn't see past the early stages that were all part of it, And so they'd ask me questions like, well, what are these empty boxes? Like, that looks dumb. What is that? And I'm like, that's a wireframe mock-up. That's where the stuff is going to go. It's just not ready yet, Or why are those photos all blurry and those don't even look like people we know? And it's like, well, that's placeholder, it's stock imagery, we're waiting on the real photography, or why is it all Latin? Well, that's lorem ipsum. If you've ever worked in publishing or layout design, it's like, this is dummy type, we're waiting on the real copy, all this stuff, It just didn't matter how much I tried to explain it. They couldn't see past what was right in front of them. A rough, unfinished work in progress. And a lot of times they didn't like what they were seeing. And sometimes I didn't like them very much either, to be honest with you, right? So we're talking about relationships in this series because I'm convinced, and I think you are too, that really everything that matters in life really boils down to this. It's all about relationships. And even while I think a lot of us, we know this and we want this, it's like sometimes, and maybe a lot of times, we can't help ourselves from doing things and saying things that seem right in the moment that ultimately end up undermining or even fracturing those relationships that mean so much to us. And the tragic reality with that is that if we continue in those patterns of behavior, and if we continue down that path, then we'll ultimately end up pushing away the people that we love so much. And none of us want to get to that place in life because we all know that a life that is absent of love is an empty way of life. And so I really believe that this is true for us no matter where you are in your faith journey today, whether you are somebody who is growing in your faith and you're following Jesus, or you're somebody who's still exploring your faith and trying to figure this out. I mean, this is true for all of us, no matter where we find ourselves in that continuum, that we owe it to ourselves to learn this seemingly lost art of loving well. And so in this series, we're asking ourselves this question. How do we learn to love in ways that draw people closer instead of pushing them away? Now here's where this gets a little bit challenging. You see, everyone in your life, every single person in your life is a work in progress. And that includes you. Right? We are all works in progress. We're all imperfect human beings in various stages of completion. And that's true no matter how old you are. Right? As Christians, we usually say it like this, that we're still maturing in our faith. We're growing spiritually, which is really just another way of saying we're still growing up, every single one of us. And what that means is that we all bring all sorts of flaws into every single one of our relationships. We bring all of our imperfections and all of our shortcomings into these relationships. And so at work, what this looks like, it's like we make those careless mistakes that create a whole lot of extra work and a whole lot of problems for our coworkers. Or at home in our marriages, right? We kind of keep doing mindlessly those things that our spouse has asked us time and time again to stop doing or to start doing, right? We just keep not doing it and it drives them crazy. Or as parents, it's why we lash out in frustration at our kids at the end of a long day. And listen, kids, I know we got some young people in the room. In our defense, in your mom and dad's defense, just a little real talk here. Because you need to know that when you stockpile your dirty dishes in your bedroom, and then you bring them all out at once after the kitchen has been cleaned up and all the dishes have been put away, that's super annoying, okay? Super annoying. It's probably about as annoying as when I go to my adult kids with the brilliant advice that they didn't ask for, you know? All of these things, they just have a way of testing our patience with each other. Because anytime human beings come into close proximity with one another, it's just a recipe for disagreement. It's a recipe for betrayals, even broken hearts. And at the risk of sounding really pessimistic here, it's really not a question of if the people close to you will fail you at some point. It's when and how. And to be honest, you'll probably return the favor too, right? Because we're imperfect people. We're works in progress, which means we're only seeing the rough, unfinished versions of each other. And so it's no wonder that we don't always like what we see. And you know, conflict is normal, right? Conflict can even be healthy. That's not necessarily the problem. That's not really even what the message is about this morning. The problem is that we too often allow an annoyance to become a grievance that leads to a severance in the relationship. And so when it comes to love, we have to learn how to live graciously with other works in progress, because we're all just trying to figure this thing out. And that's what loving well is really all about. It's about giving people the time and the space they need as they grow emotionally and spiritually. And the truth is, we all need a lot of grace on this journey. Don't we? And by grace, I'm talking about this undeserved and really unconditional kindness towards someone else. We all need that kind of grace. We need a lot of grace. And so we should be ready to give a lot of grace. Now, the Apostle Paul, somebody who talked a lot about this. If you're not familiar with Paul and who he is, he was really this first century pastor, really, who started out in Jerusalem, and then he would travel around to all over the ancient world there in the Mediterranean region, and stop in these little towns and start all these churches, and then years later, he would write letters to these churches. We actually have several of his letters in our New Testament scriptures. And so one of those letters is a letter that he wrote to a group of Christians in this little town called Colossae in what is modern-day Turkey now. And he's talking about this very thing that we're talking about. In fact, he gets toward the end of this letter and he starts using this metaphor to make a point. He's talking about like putting on clothes or taking off certain other kinds of clothes. And he starts by talking about attitudes and behaviors that we should take off, so to speak. Like, get rid of those. In other words, stop doing these things. And he's talking about like anger and malice and slander and rage, lying to each other. And keep in mind, he's writing this to a group of Christians, right? To a church. And he's talking like these are things that are actually happening and issues that need to be dealt with because, in fact, apparently they probably were. Issues that were going on among those people. And Paul's like, listen, I get it. This is how you used to be, right? This is how things were. This is how you used to do it. But you're not that person anymore. Jesus has given you new life. You are a new person, but you still do this kind of stuff because you're still a work in progress. But notice this. I mean, these behaviors and attitudes that Paul is saying, like, get rid of these things, take these things off, they're not only inconsistent with the life of Jesus, but they're also incompatible with the relationships that we have with one another. In fact, they were destroying the relationships among the Colossians. And so when we get to Colossians chapter 3, verse 12, Paul is basically saying, okay, now you've taken this stuff off. Now you need to put these things on. Here's what he says in verse 12. He says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. I mean, these are all the qualities. These are all qualities that Paul basically says, listen, this should describe you and every other Christian everywhere, right? In fact, what Paul is doing here is he's actually describing the character of Jesus himself, which isn't surprising because Paul is reminding us once again, as he did time and time again, that as followers of Jesus, it's really his life is our life. The life of Jesus is meant to be lived out through our life. And little by little, through faith and surrender, we're becoming more like him all the time, right? So that when others look at us, they actually see Jesus. And that's really the journey that all of us as followers of Jesus are on. But here's what stood out to me with what Paul is saying here in this verse. And it's a couple of things. First of all, there's an underlying assumption and there's an undeniable fact. And the underlying assumption behind what Paul is doing here, what he's saying, these list of instructions, these virtues, is that people will make your life difficult. That's the assumption. It's going to happen. Even the people who love you, even the people who love Jesus, they're going to mess things up from time to time. They're going to make your life difficult. And as sad as it is, this isn't unexpected. It's not unusual. This is why Paul actually says, listen, you need to clothe yourselves with these things, right? All of you, you need to put on kindness. You need to put on gentleness and patience because the people around you, they're going to get under your skin. They're going to push your buttons. They're going to wrong you. They're going to hurt your feelings. And you are going to need supernatural patience with them. You're going to need the kind of patience that God produces in you through his Spirit. In fact, you're going to need the same kind of patience that God himself has lavished on you and me time and time again. Works in progress, right? So Paul's like, listen, just count on it. Just assume it. They're going to let you down. That's the underlying assumption here. Now, the undeniable fact about these virtues is that they only exist in relationship, right? So think about this. Paul's like basically saying, listen, you can just bet on it that people are going to let you down. So move in closer. Get closer to them. Because the only way you can live these things out is in close community with one another. I mean, I can't really show compassion if I never leave my couch. You know, Taylor did a great job talking about that in week 1 of the series. And you know, what is kindness if there's really no one on the other side of me to even receive it? And humility, when I'm all alone, I mean, that makes me the humblest person in the room, which not really, that kind of, you know, that joke was a bit of a dud, which is a great way to humble yourself. But you see where I'm going with this, right? In fact, I think you could say with all of these that they'd be a lot easier with no one around to test them in our lives, right? But then again, that just defeats the whole purpose. In fact, it's what makes these virtues so challenging that also and at the same time makes them so necessary. Because we are to show them most of all to the people in our lives who deserve them least of all. I mean, that's who gets our patience. That's who needs our gentleness and our kindness. I mean, really, you could just take what Paul's saying here, everything that he lists here in this passage: compassion, kindness, gentleness, humility, patience. And you can summarize it all with just one word: grace. Undeserved, unconditional kindness and mercy towards someone else. And it's strange when you begin to think of it like this. But when someone is good to me, there's no need for grace in that relationship. You know, like if they're good to me and I'm good back to them, I'm just responding in kind. That's not grace. And so the only context for grace to flow from one person to the other is when a wrong has been committed to that person. That's the only time I can show grace to them, is when they've wronged me in some way. I mean, that's the context for this kind of love. So what Paul is helping us see here is that just because people will make our lives difficult, it doesn't mean that these relationships have to fracture or break down or fall apart. In fact, what Paul is ultimately getting at here is the opposite. That our problems with imperfect people can actually become opportunities to love them more deeply. And to take that a step further, they become opportunities for all of us to experience more of Jesus in each other. But it starts here, it starts with me, it starts with you, and it starts with this radical shift of mindset that says, I will give a lot of grace because I need a lot of grace. I will give a lot of grace because I need a lot of grace. And here's how that looks in real life with real people in the midst of real relational challenges. It's what Paul says next here in verse 13. He says, bear with each other. Bear with each other, right? In other words, stick around. Don't take off when things get real and get challenging. Don't cancel someone after one offense, which seems to be kind of the cultural trend these days, right? But you're still a work in progress. They're still a work in progress. So bear with each other. And then the big one here, forgive one another. Forgive one another. Here's what Paul's saying. He's saying, give them some grace. Show them a little grace, man. I mean, be kind, merciful, gentle, and patient with them, and have the humility to take the initiative. And this is what it looks like to love imperfect people well, and this is how our shortcomings actually become the context for deeper relationship to flourish. And I know that sounds a little strange, but think of it like this. Think about this. When God decided to give humans his creation, when he decided to give us free will, the freedom to choose, he willingly left the door open for us to choose the wrong thing. He gave us the option to choose bad things. He gave us, in fact, the option to choose anything and everything other than him and his dream for our lives. He gave us that freedom, and ultimately he knew that all of us would do that at some point. And this goes back to the very beginning. I mean, you go back to the beginning of the book, right? The beginning of humanity. God put the very first human beings in the Garden of Eden, right? Paradise. And he gave them these instructions. He said, you can have everything in the garden, just not the fruit from that one tree. I mean, literally, everything else is yours, just not that one. And then the devil shows up in the garden, right? If you know the story, and he shows up in the form of a serpent, which is kind of weird. And then the serpent starts talking to the people, which is also a little weird. But he's enticing them, right? The serpent is tempting them, and finally he convinces them to eat the forbidden fruit. I mean, almost immediately they made the wrong choice. But if you're familiar with this story, if you've ever sat with this and thought about this, I wonder if you've ever asked these questions like why did God give those instructions to those people, Adam and Eve? Why did he give them those instructions without giving a whole lot of explanation behind it? Or maybe you've ever thought, why did God allow the devil into the garden in the first place? Like, why didn't he just come along and kick him out of there? Or why did God, when this conversation was happening, why didn't God show up and counterpoint everything the serpent was saying? Like, hey guys, don't forget what I said, and remember, here's the truth. Like, why didn't he do that? What if the answer to those why questions really just comes down to love? Listen, God didn't create evil. God didn't want evil to come into the world. But he chose to create a world where love is real. And real love requires real freedom. And real freedom leaves the door open to be wronged. It leaves the door open to choose the wrong things. And when we did, God responded with grace. And yes, there were consequences. You read about that, right? But ultimately, God responded with grace. I mean, and while sin was never God's design, grace was always in his heart. And when we chose the wrong thing, he chose mercy. Instead of walking away from us, he moved in closer. In fact, he came to us in the person of Jesus, the embodiment of God's grace, who came to rescue us from our sin and restore our relationship with God. And what this means is that God has been incredibly good to us, even when we haven't been. He has been good even when we have not been. And if that's how he is with us, then I think we just need to ask ourselves, am I willing to extend that same gracious love to the people who frustrate me, who make my life difficult, who hurt me, who wrong me? And this is why real forgiveness with real people in real life isn't easy. But then I remember I'm still a work in progress. I'm not perfect. I have flaws, and I don't need just a little bit of grace. I need a lot of grace. So I will give a lot of grace. Here's how Paul says that at the end of verse 13. If we could put that back up there, he says, "Forgive as the Lord forgave you." Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Paul's reminding them, listen, you needed grace. You were given grace. So why would you then turn around and withhold it? I mean, just think back to the specific ways that God has forgiven you and all that he's forgiven you of. Yeah, but that's different, right? I mean, I think that's how we so often push back on that. Oh, yeah, but that was different, right? Different time, different circumstances. Things were different then. Really, it was different, but the only thing different was that we were the ones at fault. You know, like, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but when we're the ones at fault, we want mercy. But when it's someone else, we want justice. In fact, we demand it, right? And this is why so many of our relationships fracture under the strain of our imperfections. And actually, what Paul is calling us to here is so much bigger than just extending mercy to someone who's offended us. He's helping us understand that through our forgiveness, we're actually playing a part in that person's process of becoming and growing and developing as a human being and growing in their faith journey. And also, when we forgive someone else, that is playing a part in our process of becoming as well, in our growing, in our developing, in our maturing, because it's allowing what you've received from God and experienced in him to flow through you to someone close to you. I mean, it's an invitation for those of us who've been reconciled to God through Jesus to join him in his ongoing work as reconcilers in this world. And what that means is that when other people look at you and they look at your attitudes and your behavior and your words, they're seeing an accurate reflection of God's love in you. And the real test with this is how people experience us when they've wronged us. Will we lash out? Will we blow up, retaliate, demand justice, end the relationship? Or will we respond to them with the same gracious and forgiving love that our Heavenly Father has shown us? And I know it's one thing for me to stand up here and say this to you on a Sunday morning in a place like this. It's so easy to say it out loud here. But then it's a whole other thing when we get out there and we're trying to live this out in real life with real people and real struggles. And the only way we can is with God's help to learn to recognize our own flaws and try to see those flaws as God sees them. And to try to see our flaws as other people experience them. And as parents, I think this helps us immensely with this. As parents, as a father, I'll just tell you, I love my kids so much. I'm crazy about my kids, and yet at the same time, they drive me crazy sometimes. And, our small group, and I talked about our elder retreat earlier, everyone on our small group and everyone on our elder board, we all have like teenage kids or young adult kids or grown kids out of the house, and almost always our conversations turn into some sort of like parenting support group, right? Because we need help. Parenting isn't easy, and so we need help, and we're there to help each other. But I love my kids so much, but they do drive me crazy. In fact, I looked at my two youngest kids earlier this week, like 15 and 19 years old, and I said, "You guys are great kids, but you're the worst roommates." Not a real parenting win necessarily, but just real life, right? So one of the things I've noticed with my kids, though, is that every single one of the flaws that I see in them are flaws that I see in me. It's like looking at a mirror and just reflecting that back to me. I look at all the ways that they've hurt me. I look at the ways that they've maybe disappointed me at times. I look at the ways that they've rebelled against me, frustrated me, and I realize, man, I did all the same things to my parents when I was their age. And now it's interesting because on the flip side of this equation, I can remember being their age, and I'm thinking, you know what? All the things that my parents used to say to me and do to me that I just thought were so annoying and so frustrating and used to drive me crazy, now I'm doing a lot of those same things to my kids. It's like this whole cycle, right? In fact, I don't know how many times this has happened in 25 years of being a dad where I've been dealing with something with one of my kids, and a memory will come out of nowhere of something I said or did to one of my parents. And I'll think, man, I was such a jerk. And I'm calling him up. I'm like, I don't know if you remember this. 30 years ago, but I am so sorry. All these years later, I finally get it. I know how this must have made you feel. I get it now. I'm sorry. This whole experience, just living in this kind of closeness with other people, and it doesn't just happen in our families, it happens elsewhere too. It's like this cycle that reflects back to us our own personal flaws, if we will pay attention, if we'll notice these things. And when I recognize that we all share the same basic flaws, although they may come out in different ways, it helps me to respond with grace. Not perfectly, of course, because I'm still dealing with my own stuff. We're works in progress, every single one of us. But what if we learn to see the flaws in others through our own flaws? What if this became the lens through which we see others? And what if we started to see the faults and annoyances and even grievances that we experience with others as an opportunity to draw closer to them instead of pushing them away? But you know what I think we so often do instead? Is we do everything within our power to try to mitigate the ways that people can get close enough to hurt us. Right? It looks like a wall, like we talked about in our last series. It looks like keeping everything on the surface, like we talked about last week. It looks like shutting down a conversation before things get too deep. It looks like trying to control the narrative at times, or maybe it just reaches a point where we just walk away. We just leave. And all of these are strategies to avoid being hurt, but they also guarantee that no one gets close enough to me to really love me. No one gets close enough to me to actually see the love of God in me or to allow the grace of God to flow through me. And I want to pause here to acknowledge something. I want to be really careful with this because we're talking a lot about forgiveness. We're talking a lot about grace, but what we're not talking about is tolerating abuse. This doesn't mean that we ignore toxic patterns.— the most loving thing we can do is we can put a boundary in that relationship. the most loving thing for you, the most loving thing for them. Grace and boundaries can coexist. And so I want to be really clear about that. But what this does mean is that when our flaws collide with the flaws in someone else, these become opportunities for both of us to practice loving well, to experience God's healing grace and mercy. And it starts with me. It starts with you. And I love what Peter said and what he wrote in the scriptures. He wrote a couple of letters. This was Jesus's one of his best friends, closest followers. But he wrote this. He said, above all, love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. Listen, love doesn't pretend like these things don't matter. Love just chooses not to weaponize it. Love just chooses not to let these become a wedge that's going to drive us apart. And when love flourishes in our relationships, it means that we won't be easily offended. It means that we'll be able to endure the imperfections that we experience in others because we know that we're all just works in progress. And as followers of Jesus, we forgive the faults that we experience in others because we know the forgiving love of God in our own lives. And it's within that atmosphere of gracious love that we're invited to care about others, that we're invited to become more aware of our flaws and how they're impacting the people around us so that together we can continue to grow closer to God and closer to one another and closer to the people that God has created us to be. The reality is we need a lot of grace on this journey. So let's be known as people who give a lot of grace. Would you bow your heads with me? Father, as we've acknowledged already, this is easy to talk about. It's easy to say it. It's a whole other thing to actually do it. And I'm just so grateful that you gave us this model. You gave us this picture of a life where love was shown like this, where grace was given like this. First of all, from you, God, but then through your Son, Jesus, to each and every one of us. We wouldn't be where we are today. We wouldn't have a relationship with you today if it wasn't for your grace. And so, as human beings and as imperfect as we are, Father, we just pray for your help and your strength. Help us to love well. Help us to extend the grace to others that we've received from you. And give us wisdom in that, Father. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, Cypress.